the great medicine. And again, I should say, this great medicine is something that touches the very core of what creates all the suffering in the universe. So it's no trivial study. Of course, the limitations lies in the presenter here, just an ordinary being. But then again, you have the words, the written words from some really extraordinary great masters. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't regard this teaching as really something of tremendous value that gets right to the core of everything that exists in the universe of suffering comes from this subjective ignorance of clinging to self, positing other. And on the basis of that, we have likes, dislikes, we have all our kleshas, the afflictions. And on the basis of these, we have all the actions that drive our rebirth again and again in samsara. So in that we're addressing this, we should think how this has relevance for the entire world. And so it's not a limited project. So we should have this preparation with bodhicitta. And you find, of course, in this study, you find some information, but then again, it's really a work that's very concise. It sums up a lot of teachings that you might find elsewhere, like Words of My Perfect Teacher, the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, the teaching on the three visions, the Lamrim, the Great Gradual Path, and so forth. So we have here something that summarizes a lot of really extraordinary great teachings. And so we should have this this book as, like they say in classical Tibetan, it's something you should keep by your bedside. It's one of these pithy works. Okay, I'll take off the video here just for the time being. So just since this is the last time, I just thought to go over the content of what we've actually covered. So this has operated within the framework of what we call virtuous at the beginning, the middle, and the end. So at the beginning, we saw introduction to this text, which was about how to listen to the teaching and to generate a motivation, like I was just describing before, the relevance and value for liberating all sentient beings. So keeping this as our context. Then the first chapter was where we identified the awakened mind, basically Buddha nature. And in addition to that, then we also understood how this Buddha nature is misunderstood. And so we create our entire experience, like I was also talking about before, ignorance that generates kleshas and karma. And then we looked at the preliminary reflections, the taking refuge, and then the developing the enlightened awakened mind, what we call bodhicitta. And then working with adverse circumstances, the afflictive emotions, you could say the reality of us being persons with clinging to a self. And in relation to that, then the practice of Tonglen, the practice of giving away one's own happiness, taking others' suffering, understanding how we generate suffering and confusion, and generating compassion for sentient beings on just the relative level, and then also understanding the actual reality of our mind. And this is referred to as absolute bodhicitta. And in extension to that, then there's the 9th chapter, which was on the Great Perfection. And this is where the question before in regard to Paltro Rinpoche and Lungtok, their conversation about introducing the nature of mind. And then with the practice of the great perfection, there is the necessity of clearing deviations. So we'd want to understand how we practice without any flaw. And then we're presently at the 11th chapter, which is then the practice of post-meditation. Now, this is quite important, really, because with our practice so far, we've looked at how to practice and arrive at a place where we have you could say, a shift in our agenda, a shift in our way of relating to ourselves, understanding ourselves and our world. And this we particularly cultivate through the practice of meditation. But here there's a brief mention of post-meditation, where Shechen Gyaltsap, he says, between practice sessions, develop generosity and the other paramitas without the three concepts. And this is incredibly pithy. We could say that possibly not to stray into habits and ordinariness is one of the most important instructions about what we should really do, because that's, if you're like me, this is what happens. We get up from our cushion and then we get carried away by our perceptions and reactive patterns and so forth. And Rabjam Rinpoche, he says, try to establish the nature of mind during meditation sessions. And that's, of course, you could say, great if we could do that, but otherwise just to have some practice of shamatha vipassana, some practice of bodhicitta, and then do not stray into habits and ordinariness between sessions. So that's what we would want to do with what we call post-meditation. And here we have something which is known as then the 6 paramitas, which for many people might be familiar. It's generosity, discipline, patience, energy or diligence, concentration, and wisdom. So these are practices that have a lot to do with doing. I'll get back to that. But as we practice these 6 paramitas, and this is going to be we're going to discuss this a few times, we'd want to realize that any practice we do ideally should be without 3 concepts, or should be heading in that way. And with that we mean freedom from fixating on the subject who's doing something, the object, and the action. Because typically when we do something, we're very aware of how we are interacting with the object. There's a strong sense of self, there's a strong sense of object, there's a strong sense of the action. So, but there's something that's necessary to identify with the 6 paramitas and with post-meditation. And that is what we're really doing with the 6 paramitas is we're applying what's called skillful means. We could say dwelling in meditation is cultivating wisdom, is understanding wisdom, how to get cut through confusion and begin to have some sense of, you could say, freedom from our ordinary klesha-ridden mind, some space. We cut through our confusion. So that, you could say, as we've looked at before, it's beyond, something beyond concepts, it's intangible, it's non-dualistic and so forth. But our dualistic phenomena, which we humbly have to acknowledge, is very real, which is driven by habitual patterns, clinging to the self, afflictive emotions, our karmic patterns, and so on. All of this we need to actually relate to. We need to take this as the stuff of the past. So we can't just compartmentalize and forget who we are as dualistic individuals and just focus on the sweet-sounding high vocabulary of spirituality. idealistic spirituality. We actually have to integrate what we experience. And to make this part of our dualistic experience, our confusion and so forth, to relate to that and turn that into the path, that is what we call skillful means. So this can be very different depending on who we are. For example, a Tibetan practitioner, for someone like that, it might mean taking ordination, while skillful means for a contemporary Australian person might mean taking a higher education or a 9-to-5 job. Either way is relating to the particular person's needs. The Tibetan will generate the right conditions for liberation through being ordained. Such a person might have a very ordinary, down-to-earth relationship with the practice of ordination. And so that person will really thrive. And such a person might be thoroughly distracted if he or she continued being a layperson. However, let's say an Australian takes ordination as a nun or a monk. They might actually be rather fascinated with this exotic institution. And for them, actually relating to something that relating to their reality might actually entail getting an education, getting a job, and discovering real discipline within their ordinary life. And they're gaining a sense of achievement. This might be familiar to some people, but it's something that really needs to be stressed, because the working with our confusion is really what enables us to cut through and discover a sense of liberation. Otherwise, you could say all our confusion sits sort of lurks and festers in the shadows. And skillful means, like the paramitas, they enable us to work with who we are rather than who we would like to wishfully think we could be. So wisdom, yes, it's universally present as our ultimate potential, but we as confused beings, we need to work with what is. We can even say the entire path is skillful means. Everything we do in Buddhism is skillful means to unveil wisdom. We sit down, we meditate, and we cultivate compassion, whatever we're doing. Just sitting in a meditation posture, that's skillful means. And so on. So we are going to be looking at how then we can integrate. So now, so what I just said here, then the path has these two aspects of wisdom and skillful means. We see that a lot, particularly in Vajrayana. Actually, we speak about Vajradhara holding Vajra and Ganta, which symbolizes wisdom and skillful means, and so forth. The various Buddhas have two arms, and that very often is said to be symbolizing means and wisdom, and so on. So we are already in the discussions of absolute bodhicitta and the great perfection. We've talked about the unconditional freedom as wisdom, freedom from conceptual construction, and so forth. And then skillful means are the methods that enable us to realize this. So post-meditation requires the skillful means of integrating the wisdom of meditation. So we sit and we do some practice, and the post-meditation is then integrating that experience. And like I said before, skillful means can differ depending on the individual and depending on the circumstances. Even in the Vinaya, actually, it says the Vinaya and the rules of the Vinaya need to adapt according to times and place. So looking at these 6 paramitas then, paramita means to go beyond, go to the other shore. And these are then, like I said before, generosity, patience, discipline, diligence, and concentration, and wisdom. By the way, some of these have attempts to have diacritic marks, but it's not consistent, so don't get too caught up in that. But As far as the first 5 go, then we could say these constitute skillful means, and the last one, wisdom. But as we'll see, these actually, particularly with this reference to go beyond subject, object, and action, wisdom is continually present as a very provocative dimension in our practices of the first 5. Again, the first 5, they have to do with action, and basically what these 5 are methods, you could say, framework to enable us to experience bodhicitta in action, which means that they lead us to becoming greater, more generous, more courageous, more compassionate persons, but through our actions, not just through sitting and meditating. And that's why they're immensely important. So otherwise you could say, and this is important again, coming back to the wisdom, that these are paramitas, and so they need to have this perspective of wisdom, this freedom from clinging, fixating to on the subject, the object, and the action. Because without that, then we could practice generosity, but that could become further credentials. That could give a sense of, I am incredibly generous, and aren't those recipients fortunate? And wasn't that a tremendous, generous gift that I presented there? So we can see that actually that is generosity, but it still lacks. And the degree to which we actually could let go of that fixating on self, recipient, and the giver, the recipient, and the action, the degree to which we could let go of that, to that degree then generosity becomes a real genuine paramita. But then again, we shouldn't be discouraged and think that we can only do this if it's absolutely perfect. And if we don't have that wisdom, then we can't be bothered to practice generosity. Generosity in itself brings about non-duality. So all the way through, this is something that we shouldn't hesitate. Again, we say that when we practice the paramitas, we seal them, or we seal this practice. By the way, the Tibetan word for virtue, gyewa, is the same actually as doing practice. When we say to do some practice, we sometimes say nyamlen, but we also say gyaltsap, which means root of virtue. And so it has doesn't have the connotation that we might have with, you could say, sort of a slightly archaic sense of being good. It's very real. Anyway, we've discussed this before, but whatever we do in terms of practice, in terms of something that's coming from a place of bodhicitta, and particularly then with regards to these 6 paramitas, we want to seal them in the sense that we typically would say seal in the sense of something that gets a stamp, right? And that's sort of the final thing about it. And in this way also, what really is the last word on the paramitas is that they should really have this dimension of understanding that we don't want to fixate on these 3, subject, object, and action. Rabjam Rinpoche, he says, as they are free from the 3 concepts, the subject who acts, the object of action, and the action itself, they can help us create merit and wisdom. So freedom from the 3 concepts of self, other, and action, it sounds, you could say these paramitas, Rabjam Rinpoche says, they're free from these 3 concepts, and it might sound like a great, great scope, a very high objective. But it's something that we experience. So like I was saying before, if we think of when someone gives, if it comes with strings attached and the giver expects gratitude, so even though they are giving, and you could say that in itself is, of course, being very generous and so forth, it still comes with this strong sense of a giver, that there's a strong sense of the recipient, and that there's someone there is this, the object, the gift. So you can say there's a burden present as long as these three concepts, they're there. While if somebody gives and they do so with joy, without any expectation, they might not even wish to be noticed. There's much less of a burden. In fact, there's some degree of lightness. And that's where we could begin to sense, intuit true generosity. And here we're describing then in the nth degree then with a great bodhisattva, they would have much less clinging to that, possibly up to the 10th booming. There's still some subtle traces of duality, but still it's only very fine obscurations. And we should say that the absence of these three concepts is something that we presently aspire to do. And that's why when we give something, we want to be aware of, we might be burdening the situation if we have expectations. So we humbly acknowledge that in our delusion, we attribute solidity to these three. But then again, we want to understand that in reality, these are non-existent. So with the path, it's not as if we're achieving some impossibly heroic insight, but we're simply unveiling reality that's free from delusion, that's free from these three: subject, object, and action. Now, whether we practice generosity or patience or discipline or whatever it might be, these then contribute to eliminating these three concepts. Again, as we practice, even if we can't remain in this freedom from this threefold concept, we can still, as we practice some virtue, we can seal the practice with emulating the great bodhisattvas. So when we've done something great, we might have a sense of self and other and so forth, but then we make prayers just thinking, by the merit of this, may others achieve happiness and so forth. And you have prayers such as in the prayer of excellent action, lines like where it says, emulating the courageous and omniscient Manjushri and Samantabhadra, I follow your example by dedicating the merit of this practice. So that means even if we don't properly know how to dedicate free from these three concepts, even if we can't do that, then we just think, may I do just like Manjushri and Samantabhadra and the other bodhisattvas they did. And also we can look at our teachers and see how when they practice some act of generosity, it's not as if they're sort of waiting there for some recognition. And so we actually have some idea of what it looks like. So we should have that aspiration. To get to the first then, generosity, then there are famously three aspects. And by the way, if you look in works like Words of My Perfect Teacher, Jewel Ornament and Liberation, it might be the wording here, the terms and how it's translated might be slightly different, but it should be more or less consistent with what it says here. So generosity in general, and Rabjam Rinpoche, he recommends try to stay with that meditative experience of resting, where we're free from being caught up in our narratives around a self. And then considering giving, we train ourselves in imagining that we're doing this without grasping at the object and without grasping at the act of giving in itself. So in this way, we aspire to actually carry this out in post-meditation. And that is something that will enable us to eliminate confusion at the root. So although we are not possibly at the sublime level of practicing generosity, then we can still do it, and we should do it, even if we are doing it in a we maybe not doing it in a non-dualistic way, but we train ourselves. So the first kind, material giving, means giving food and clothing. And then also we could give eventually treasured possessions. We could give that away. And even our clinging to dear friends and relatives. So we famously have stories of great bodhisattvas who had no hesitation in giving away their own body. We have stories of the Buddha in a previous life. And actually in the 19th century, we had a great master, Tibetan, called Dola Jigme Khalzang. And there's a story of him. He was a master of the Longchen Yingtik tradition. He was a what was he? He was a student of the first Rabjam Rinpoche, I think. Anyway, he was in China, and he came across somebody who was about to be executed. And the man was just screaming and in great fear and great agony. And Dola Jigme Khalzang, he couldn't bear that. So he rushed up to the place where this man was being executed and said, no. He didn't do it, I did it. And the man went free, and Jigme Khalzang, he was executed in his place. He was a great Lama, and his disciples, they sort of couldn't find him, and they then found out what had happened to him. But this is an example of someone who is a great bodhisattva then, and who then can do that. Of course, this is not something we should do if we don't have that kind of capacity. The next kind, the giving of Dharma, it's a bit like our saying about teaching a man to fish. So with the giving of Dharma, we enable someone to free themselves from the root of suffering. And we have examples, Rabjam mentions, great masters who teach countless beings and bring countless tremendous benefit. And the third kind is then to provide safety and release from fear, as we do with animal release, for example. This is a lot of there's a lot of practice of that in the Himalayan region and also in other Buddhist cultures. Personally, I remember once being with Rabjam Rinpoche in Bhutan, and we met some people who were driving a great, huge yak towards Paro, and this was presumably to be slaughtered. And Rabjam Rinpoche, he stopped the car and he bought the yak, and then the yak was free. So this is quite a common practice. So this is what we mean then with giving protection from fear. Again, we want to do this without too much clinging to subject, object, and action. Then we have discipline, and this constitutes avoiding the 10 non-virtues and engaging in the 10 virtues, and finally acting solely for the benefit of all beings. And I think many are familiar with these 10 non-virtues. I actually wanted to sort of be upbeat and be positive and put the 10 virtues over on the left side, so they came first. But I actually realized our sort of the real force of this, the logic of this, is actually that we habitually are inclined towards non-virtue, and so hence it's really what needs to be understood first, actually. If you look I looked in the Tibetan dictionary for the 10 virtues, and it doesn't actually describe the 10 virtues. It just says the opposite of the 10 non-virtues. So we identify the 10 non-virtues then in terms of body, which is killing, stealing, sexual misconduct; speech, lying, slandering, harsh speech, idle talk; and in mind, in terms of mind, covetousness, maliciousness, and wrong view. And the opposite then are the 10 virtues: not killing, not taking what has not been given, ethical sexual conduct, truthfulness, not slandering, avoiding abusive language, not indulging in idle chat, and mind, not being covetous, not being malicious, and right view. So we essentially, in the first, we avoid the first 10, and the second, we engage in the next 10, and then finally is then anything that we do it for the benefit of all beings. Okay. Any questions? It's all clear? Okay. No questions. All right. Patience. Kshanti. And the patience is first, there's the three kinds here: bearing harm, not being sort of discouraged when suffering happens, and then patience on the path, which comprises the hardships we might undergo, and then freedom from conceptual constructs, or the realization of emptiness. So the first is then basically to perfectly bear any harm inflicted on us, which then means also, even though harm is inflicted on us, that we don't just bear it and possibly begrudgingly, but we actually truly don't mind. So that's what the first is. Then the second is to whatever suffering that we happen to encounter, we experience with a positive attitude. We use it as the path. So this we have a lot of teachings. We had it in, I forget which chapter, but it's part of bringing, yes, the chapter on bringing hardships onto the path. And it's really a key theme in all the Lojong mind training practice we have. And the third then, having perfect patience in regard to the hardships of the path. This means in whatever we're doing, listening to the teachings, not being bored or impatient when we're practicing, being persevering in meditation. Whenever there's negative circumstances in our practice, to sort of just be fearless. And then finally, we refer to patience in terms of realization of emptiness, simply because this is going places that's doesn't come with a familiar credentials, doesn't come with a familiar ground. So that kind of patience is essential, that we are not afraid of lack of the familiar ground of our habitual patterns, that we have the patience to bear the realization of emptiness, to bear this freedom from habitual patterns and conceptual constructs. Diligence. We have, Rabjam Rinpoche defines this as the joy associated with striving towards a noble purpose. So translators, they're always struggling a bit to sort of convey the joy that's implicit in the Sanskrit virya. And diligence is fair enough. There's some sense of hard work, but the thing is, it's also hard work with a sense of joy. So some will translate it as energy. Jakob Rinpoche, he would translate it as vigor. And so there's different translations. Then again, it seems we end up with diligence. That's the bottom line. Now, the armor-like diligence is determination, regardless of circumstances. So we're determined to practice no matter what happens to us. We're inspired by the masters of the past, if we look, and really as practitioners, it's very helpful to look at read the life stories of the masters of the past, the lineage masters. So we should look how they did it, persevering. That's the armor-like diligence. The second is then complete dedication to Dharma practice and doing it right now, not postponing it. It's something that everyone sort of is familiar with. It's where we probably humbly recognize how we find the lamest of excuses to not practice, or we find ourselves just getting busy with useless things instead of practicing. And then the third kind is to not be jaded or feel that one has done enough, being complacent, I practiced enough, and so on. So we should be, and then there's the example of the hungry yak, where it's that the hungry yak is already eyeing the next tuft of grass as it's eating. So there's continually this joy, this eagerness to continue practicing. And Rabjam Rinpoche also says something like meditation, developing samadhi, that also requires discipline. So without that, meditation really never develops. So then we have concentration, jhana, and there's different kinds of references to jhana. In the Theravadan tradition, they're big on what we call the 4 jhanas and so on. Here, we're not really talking about that. Here we're more understanding jhanas in terms of the bodhisattva path. But we think of concentrations, then jhana in terms of just for our pleasure, ease and serenity. That's, you could say, just the kind of objective that comes with meditation at Club Med and some kinds of mindfulness, that we're just feeling good. And then, of course, there are those that are lead to spiritual qualities, more in terms of understanding how higher levels of rebirth come about. And then there's finally the concentration of bodhisattvas, of wishing to benefit others. So in this way, these are 3 different scopes, really. And Rabjam here then gives, and this you should really use in terms of meditation as meditation instruction. He instructs us to not, when we're meditating, then to not be too tight, not too loose, one-pointed, to be continuous, to be lucid, and so forth. And when we're meditating, because we have a long history of, you could say, mind just being left to its own devices, it might occasionally feel that as we're meditating, the mind is a bit like a snake that we pick up in our hand. I don't know how often you do that, but you can imagine a snake would be writhing in case we pick it up. And this is simply because we don't have the habit of introspection. We're not in the habit of looking at what's happening with the mind. So that's where we discover, gosh, we have a lot of thoughts. And in fact, it's not as if we have more thoughts than we had before, but it's just we're becoming aware of these thoughts. Now, in terms of the practice of shamatha, there's a lot of different teachings. In the, what is it again? The Mahayana Sutra Alamkara, it talks about the 9 levels of shamatha, and particularly in what we call the lineage of explanation, we talk about the 5 experiences. So that's where we have the descriptions of these 5 experiences that we have. These, and then we also have some similes, some metaphors for that. Some of you might be familiar with a work called the Shamatha Guide, and in there you see references to this. So we have 5 experiences: movement, attainment, familiarization, stability, and consummation. And with that, then we have the metaphors of the cascading mountain stream, the narrow gorge, the flowing river, the ocean, and the mountain. So as you can see, I put in some pictures there. Rabjam Rinpoche says that with meditation there has to be determination. And initially then we recognize thoughts, we discover how much we have, how many thoughts we have, and it's like a mountain torrent. There's a lot of movement. Then we gradually then, first it's like a cascading waterfall, right? Mountain stream. And then the second one is then where it's like a torrent in a narrow gorge. And then the third one is where thoughts, we begin to have some calm. And this is then where the mind is a bit like a river. And the river, if you see it from a distance, it looks as if it's just completely immobile. It's calm, but actually if you go close, you can see there's still plenty of movement. So that's an example of the third experience of familiarization. As thoughts then further subside, and this is then more on the level of, you could say, some spiritual accomplishment, then it's like the ocean. It's called the stage of stability. Yet, as we know, an ocean is still subject to conditions, just like the wind that creates ripples on the surface. So it's only when we arrive at the fifth stage, the fifth experience of consummation, that we then have accomplished the practice of meditation. And the image here then is that of a mountain. So this is regards to the first 5 paramitas. And the objective of that is then that we achieve wisdom. Now, the point, if you say, what is the point? What is all this fuss about wisdom in Buddhism? Is because that is what enables us to awake. So basically, we could see wisdom as that, the intelligence that sees through delusion. And this has nothing to do with information. This is something that is just like in the morning when we wake up. It's not like somebody tells us, now you are awake and now you're seeing this or that. We cease sleeping. And that's where this awake quality of wisdom has nothing to do with anything intellectual or conceptual. But it is seeing through delusion. Seeing, you could say, a tiger as a paper tiger, seeing the snake as a rope, and so forth. And what we do effectively is we eliminate the root of suffering and we unveil enlightenment. So this is why wisdom is so important. So there's 3 methods then to develop wisdom: through hearing, reflecting, and meditating. So we want to understand that wisdom is not something that we just randomly have. We develop wisdom, and we do that through listening to the teaching. You could say hearing a different perspective, opening up to wider horizons. And then the next phase is then reflecting, which means that we think critically. We scrutinize the validity of this teaching. Is it true for us? And also in terms of seeing the validity of the teaching, then we see how it applies to our personal experience. And we then gain certainty. And basically what we gain certainty about when we call establishing the view is we see what it is that creates confusion and what it is that is freeing us from confusion. So with that, you could say, very practical perspective, we then apply that in the third prajna of meditation. And that's where we settle in equanimity. This is where we stop perpetuating confusion, and you could say implicitly we unveil innate wisdom. So the practice of these 3, they, as Rabjam just says, they have to become second nature. As they will eventually lead us to realize primordial wisdom, jhana. So all the various practices, the 5 paramitas prior, they enable us to realize wisdom. And we also sometimes talk about the 3 trainings, which are Shila, Jhana, and Samadhi, which are then ethics, concentration, and wisdom. So the point of this entire work, what we've been looking at here, is bodhicitta. It's bodhicitta as remedy for our delusion and our clinging to reality. Rabjam just says that all practice that we do should include bodhicitta. And this, of course, applies to also the practice of the 6 paramitas. And as we said before, we dedicate all practice free from attachment to subject, object, and action. So when we have that, this is what eventually enables us to realize the objective of the path. And you could say the path then is famously understood in terms of the 2 accumulations. There's the wisdom, the prajna and so forth, and then the skillful means, the merit, what enables us to have the resources to achieve this wisdom. So these 2 go together, this merit and wisdom, skillful means and wisdom. And doing that, we then follow in the footsteps of the Buddhas of the past. So this is then concluding the chapter on the 6 paramitas. So again, this last chapter here has a very practical aspect. And now we are reaching the very end of our discussion altogether. This is the 3rd part, virtues at the conclusion. And this is then the dedication of merit, the last chapter. And Shechen Gyaltsap, he writes, dedicate everything toward great enlightenment. Such is the great excellent path uniting the 2 accumulations. Thus the path of bodhicitta, in which both relative and absolute truths are one, emptiness with the essence of compassion, is the path that gladdens the victorious ones. Meditate upon it continually, and before long, as the veils masking Buddha nature are cleared away, you will earn the title of Enlightened One. So this path, the 2 accumulations, merit and wisdom, and there's a really important term also to understand the nature of bodhicitta, and that's the last line in the 1st verse where it says, emptiness with the essence of compassion. So that is really how we should understand reality in general, that yes, there's nothing we can objectify, and yet in ceasing objectifying and that whole neurotic game of trying to cling to self and alienate other, in that we discontinue that, there's a natural quality of warmth, radiance, of love, compassion, and so forth that manifests as inseparable from that emptiness nature. So this is what really delights the victorious ones. This is what unveils Buddha nature. So it's not that the Buddhas really should be understood as that they're happy if we're doing what they want, but this is just that this is what is in concordance with reality. And then basically we can sum up what's being said here, that what our project is uncovering Buddha nature, removing these 2 veils, the veils of the kleshas and the veil of what we call the veil upon the knowable, or the cognitive veil. Shechen Gyaltsap writes, having actualized stainless, excellent qualities, manifesting ceaseless, omnipresent, and spontaneous Buddha activity, you will act as a protector for all beings under the sky. So those of you who studied the teaching, the Uttara Tantra, will remember that Buddha nature is understood as when the activity of Buddha nature, when it's unveiled, which is enlightenment, then it acts for others compassionately in terms of three aspects, which is continually, pervasively or omnipresent, and spontaneously. So enlightenment, Rabjam Rinpoche says, enlightenment is endowed with innumerable qualities that manifest as all-encompassing compassion. Spontaneous Buddha activity does not require any effort or particular intent. It springs naturally from the compassionate wisdom of the Buddhas. Through this ceaseless compassion and enlightened beings, every action becomes beneficial to all beings. So this is what Rabjam had to say about that. So again, what we're doing here is uncovering what was always there, but that possesses infinite qualities. So we could say the fact that we recognize selflessness, that we recognize kindness and strength and so forth, and we rejoice when we see it, that it appeals to us, speaks about the Buddha nature that we have within. And we are then, through the path, we are able to unveil this with all the qualities that come with that. So this was written by Shechen Gyaltsap, who then at the end writes, I, Padma Vijayan, that's his name. It means Vijaya, victorious, victorious lotus, Namjal, yeah, all victorious lotus. Thus I, Padma Vijaya, having drunk the instructions that streamed forth from the mouths of the great lineage holders, have looked a little into them, and now, having a little experience of them, at the request of a noble Dharma friend, I have spoken this short explanation. So this is something we find at the end of all Dharma texts, something that explains the context for the composition. And then then there's some verses of dedication. By this merit, may the altruistic awakened mind be born in the mind streams of all sentient beings. May they see the ultimate truth unveiled, the very face of Buddha nature. So Rabjam Rinpoche, he joins in and rejoices in the beauty and the value of the text. And we here, coming from all sorts of different places, logging on and tuning in and so forth, we've done something very valuable. I'd like to thank you all for providing the opportunity to take the role of presenting this, and I rejoice in all of you having the interest in this. So we've done something quite valuable. Of course, what's implicit is that the true value of this will come from practice as we become clearer, freer human beings, that we discover greater scope of compassion and courage. Rabjam Rinpoche, he, interestingly enough, he compares this to when we come across the wonderful theory of a weight loss program, and we read about it and we get enthused, but of course the real value of it is in applying it. And then there's something else, which is And he makes quite a point about this. We need to continually check ourselves. How are we doing? Are we really becoming better persons? And Dingyaltsap Rinpoche used to talk about how we need to mingle our minds with the Dharma. We need to blend our character with that of the Dharma. Our character shouldn't be in one place and then the Dharma something else, compartmentalized, but there needs to be a unveiling of the sanity within, according to the Dharma, and we need to check if the Dharma is doing well. If we, for example, we are getting angry easily, that's a sign that something's not quite right. A genuine practitioner should at least, even if they don't become fully enlightened right now, they at least should have some indication of becoming a good human being. So we need to check if our experience lines up with the Dharma. Rabjam Rinpoche says, after years of practice, we should gain a sense of inner peace and become less vulnerable to outer circumstances. Masters like Paltro Rinpoche experience great joy and profound happiness as a result of their Dharma practice. Inner freedom, relaxed and open happiness and joy will arise when negative emotions and mental confusion disappear. In contrast, we will have missed the point of the practice if our mental poisons are still all-powerful, torment us constantly, and cause us to remain preoccupied with ourselves. So in general, when we read a book like this or any Dharma book, we get a sense of the wisdom of the author. So we want to have this as something which inspires our practice. And Rabjam Rinpoche, he concludes, may these teachings inspire a few to take these steps on the path to compassion and freedom with enthusiasm and confidence. So that's where the teaching finishes, and I'll just see if there's any questions. Okay, somebody says, Jakob, could you please show the slide with the table of the 10 non-virtues and 10 virtues, and also the slide with the 5 stages of shamatha, so I can finish writing them down? You know what? I'll include these as just PDFs. So when I send out the links to the recording, I'll just include them there. Yeah, I hope that works. All right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here for this study. And I should just mention that in October, November, then there'll be another similar online study. It's the 100 Verses of Advice from Padamba Sanjay, who was a great yogi, who taught down in the southern part of Tibet. Well, he was actually, he was an Indian yogi, came to Tibet. He was a siddha. There's some wonderful stories about him meeting Milarepa and actually them sort of having miracle competitions and so forth. It's quite amusing. But particularly there's a famous teaching which is called the 100 Verses of Advice given then to the people of a little village called Tingri, which is just on the northern side of Mount Everest. And ever since, this has really been a great set of advice, a very practical advice. Padamba Sanjay was a yogi, and Dingyaltsap Rinpoche he's then commented on that. So this is really some upadesha, some very valuable instruction for us. So if you're interested, tune in October and November. There seems to be a few more questions here. And all that remains then is just dedicating the merit. So the last will include also the dedication from Shechen Gyaltsap. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. By this merit may the altruistic awakened mind be born in the mind streams of all sentient beings. May they see the ultimate truth unveiled, the very face of Buddha nature. So thank you very much. We conclude here with some faces of enlightenment, and thank you and goodbye. Okay, there's one last question. Please could you spell the Tibetan word for virtue? Well, I don't know how well that would go. Sure. It's Dao Gao, what is it? Dao Ga Jengbo Ge Ba Gewa. Yeah. If we do it in phonetics, Gewa. So Gewa, virtue. All right. Thank you.